Hello guys, so today we're going to be doing a JZ Modular Harness using a Altezza Link plug-in ECU for a 1JZ GTE VVT-i engine. So let's get into it. Right, so as discussed, it is a JZ Modular Harness. It's using an Altezza Link plug-in ECU. It is going to be for a 1JZ GTE VVT-i, and obviously what we've done is the customer's taken an Altezza Link plug-in because we have the ECU box to put the Link ECU directly in, so it's nice and straightforward. So what we're going to do today, obviously we're going to go initially through the complete layout of the harness. Then we're going to jump into the actual testing side, which obviously involves just some bits with the ignition on, as well as obviously with the engine running. But before we jump into that, first thing I'm going to do, as it is a completely brand new built modular harness, we're going to go through and show you exactly what it looks like underneath all of that heat shrink. So let's do that now. We're back in a second.
Never break, always fight, never quit, do it right, play the game, win it life, have no shame, there's no time, feel the pain, live the grind, I could change, in my mind, pick a lane, commit and climb, the only way to win it life. I never miss, that's fact, taking big swings, put your hand to the bat, put me in the ring, you'll go out in a bag, cause I sing what I mean and I bring it to the mad light. Ain't got time to kill, I got time to feel, I took the red pill, I know life's short so I wanna live real, but how's it supposed to feel? How's it supposed to feel? How's it supposed to feel?
Right, so now you've seen what that looks like. Let's start off with the layout, which is the first thing we're going to do. And we're going to start over here at the ECU end as we usually do. So nice and simple. You've got your 4 plugs that go directly into your ECU. All different plugs, so you can't plug them into the wrong place. Obviously, the layout of the harness is going to dictate which one goes where as well anyway. Right, so as it's a plug-in ECU, we do have a couple of things that are attached to the board that's inside here. So to interface with them, we've made it nice and simple. We have drilled and fitted the communication cable in there, so that goes in there nicely. We've also put a fitting on for the map sensor, so the tube inside here goes to the board and it pops to a fitting over here so you can do the external part which goes to the engine. Next up is the CAN, because obviously the CAN bus is in a secondary plug that goes onto the board. So that's popping out here. We've put a little sort of rubber grommet in there, and that's popping out to this 2-pin connector over here. So that's going to be your CAN high and CAN low in there. Right, so moving on to the harness now. You've got our breakout section over here. First of all, popping out the back over here is our plug that goes into the fuse box that's supplying all the bits and bobs to the engine harness that is required from the fuse box over there. Coming out this side over here, we've got a few things. I'm going to start with the one on the top here. This is CAN power and ground. So we're using this obviously in combination with that, as you can see through this little harness over here, to go over to our CAN Lambda. Now, with CAN buses, as you are aware, you can add other things as well if you wanted to. So if you wanted to do a dash or anything like that, that can be interfaced with this particular CAN setup as well as the CAN Lambda. All right, moving along, we've got an auxiliary 6-pin DTM plug, and that is going to be a bunch of unused inputs and outputs that are available to use in the future if you so desire. And then lastly, we've got our pedal plug, or not lastly, our pedal plug over here. Now you might think that's weird because on the sort of ETCSI systems that come on the 1JZ GTE VVT-i, the throttle houses everything. So it houses the accelerator pedal, the TPS, the motor, everything all in one. Well, obviously, because you guys like to upgrade and you might want to swap over to a Bosch throttle body, we need to give you the functionality of being able to fit an electronic pedal inside the car. Hence this plug over here. But in all honesty, you could actually literally fit an electronic pedal at this moment in time, even using the standard throttle body, because obviously it doesn't actually mind. Obviously, you can't plug in the accelerator pedal position sensor, which I'm going to show you in a minute as we get through here. But you can either plug in one or the other, but not both. But we split it up so you can use either or, okay? Then lastly, popping out of here is our next fuse box connection, and that goes into this one over here. Now remember, the fuse boxes are nice and simple. All the plugs are different, so you can't plug them in incorrectly, so that's nice. And then lastly on the fuse box, we've got just the 2 plugs over there. Now that's going to be what I call the customer facing ones, or the ones that you guys are going to wire inside the vehicle. So to keep that nice and simple. Right, so that's this whole section over here done. So we're going to move along here. We're going to get to our grommet, which is obviously going to go through the firewall. It is heat shrunk down with SCL, so it's nice and sealed, so you're not going to get any water inside your vehicle when you do fit this in there, okay? And the grommet's big enough, obviously, to fit all of these plugs and everything through the hole that you're going to drill for it. Moving up along there, we're then going to come to another breakout over here. And that's got, I think, 3 sections popping out of it. First off is the injector sub-harness. So again, modular design, it's all unpluggable. So at the moment, the customer is just sticking with the standard injectors, but if he does require more power and he needs to upgrade his injectors and they happen to be a different connector, it's not a problem. You can give us a call. We can make him an injector harness to fit whatever injector connector or injectors that he requires. So again, really nice and simple. We've also then got our ignition sub-harness. So again, the customers opted for the Audi coils, which is what we've got plugged in here for the testing purposes. Now, obviously, the customer could go with a Denso, could go with Nissan R35 coils. It's no problem at all. He won't have to go through too much bother. He just phone us up and we'll make him a sub-harness that does that as well. Now, also, the other benefit with this, and obviously this as well, is when you do want to remove all of these to change your spark plugs, etc., you don't have to actually go and unplug each individual coil. Now, obviously, this is a bit cumbersome because there are 6 in a row, but theoretically, you could just unplug this at the back and you can pull all these 6 coils out without having to remove any of these connectors, service your spark plugs, and just put them all straight back in again and plug it in there. Because remember, the problem with all these standard connectors is usually the fact that they become brittle over time with the heat, and then obviously unplugging them is going to break them. So that's to help you guys there as well, so you don't have to keep disconnecting these every single time you want to do a spark plug change. Right. At the back of this ignition plug, what we've done is we've included the earth section to form part of the engine harness and not part of the coil harness. Again, making it easier for you guys. So if we put the earth on this side, you'd have to actually remove the earth as well as pull out all these coils in order to actually remove them. So this pops down over here. You've got quite a lot of length. At the moment, I'm just bolting it to the inlet manifold down here, but it is actually kind of designed to go to that flat piece you have at the back here on the GTE models. Those are where the engine harness is going to earth as well, but you can use this one as well to earth the coils through there. Or you can bolt to the cylinder head exactly like I've done here. It's completely up to you guys. Lastly, what we've done as well is we've been through the ECU. We know there is a map sensor built in, but not everybody wants to use that. Either it's going to be difficult to get the fitting through the firewall, or you're worried about it, chafing on the firewall and ending up with a leak and sort of killing your day. So we have actually included a map sensor plug on the harness. At the moment, you can see it's blanked off. The customer's going to go ahead and use the built-in one. If he changes his mind, it's not a problem. It's wired for any link map sensor, so we could just supply him with whatever map sensor you wanted to, fit it up on the firewall there and run it to the inlet manifold. So we give you both options there. We're not limiting you on that particular factor there. Right, so that is that section over there, and then it's going to pop up to the next breakout over here. And I think there's only 2 sections that pop out here, nice and simple. We've got our cam sensor, so remember everything is labeled for you guys, so when you come to connect it, it should be relatively straightforward. Next up is your ground. So again, I've got this in here. When you've got it in your engine, you have that flat plate over there where you had 2 ground points anyway. That's what you're going to use for this one over here as well. Okay, super nice and simple. Then we're going to move along here, and we're going to have another breakout. This has got quite a few sections over here, so let's jump into this, and I'm just going to start from the top and I'm going to work my way down. Okay, so first one over here is the fuel. So what we've done is we've put a plug on here so you are capable of adding fuel pressure and temperature in this particular case. So that is over there. In this case, the customer hasn't opted for anything, but it is there. If he does want to, he can just phone us up. We'll make him a sub harness if he wants to add a fuel pressure sensor further down the line. All right. Moving along from there, I'm just going to grab this one. This is the gearbox. So it does have the capability of wiring up a Hall effect style speed sensor, also a reverse switch. So again, if you do want to wire that in, customer can phone us up and tell us exactly what gearbox he's got, what it's capable of, and then we can make him a sub harness for that as well. Next up, we've got our throttle harness. That's the big 12-pin plug over here. Now, as I said, everything in here is included for the standard throttle body itself. So we've got our drive-by-wire plug over there, again, nicely labeled. We've got our accelerator position sensor. And again, this one's going to plug into the throttle, but again, you can use an electronic pedal if you do want to, and you would leave this one unplugged. Then we've got our TPS. Okay, so that's going to plug into the throttle body there, again, nicely labeled. And then last on the list is our intake air temperature sensor. Okay, this is the one the customer's having. So it is a Bosch fast response sensor with a Link aluminium fitting. Okay, ideally, where you designed it is so you can fit it into the tube coming up to the throttle body, so you're getting the most accurate measurement of air temperature, aka just before it comes into the throttle body. All right. So those are those sections over there. Next up, we're going to have to go down because we've got another 3 sections down here, but they are going underneath. So hopefully the light's going to shine up nicely so you can see. So the first one is this little tiny skinny one I've got in my hand over here, and that goes down and that plugs into the starter motor. All right. So again, that's just for the starter motor solenoid. That's what's going to get it cranking. You guys still need to take care of the main starter power, which is obviously this one over here, which goes to the positive side of your battery. Next up, we've got our oil one. So again, everything is nicely labeled, so you don't have to worry too much about that, but nicely labeled, that's your oil. In this case, the customer is just opting for the standard oil pressure switch that comes on the engine itself. He does have the capability of obviously adding an oil pressure and temperature sensor as well into this mix. He can actually have all 3 connected if he wants to, not just that, but a sensor as well. Next up, we've got our knock harness. Now, in this particular case, we have actually run twin core shielded cables to here. The customer in this case is opting for the standard knock sensor, so you can see them plugged in over there and obviously all labeled. But if you did want to opt for Bosch wideband knock sensors, not a problem, you can just phone us up. We can supply you with a sub harness. Not only that, we can supply you with the sensors, with the studs and the nuts to fit them into the JZ block as well. So again, if you do need that, give us a shout. Right, so all of these are designed to actually go down into there, obviously because the throttle's over here, so the throttle harness will go down and then come forward. Obviously the gearbox would come down and go to the gearbox, and again the fuel would come down there, and then either depending on if you're fitting a separate regulator and the fuel pressure sensors in there, obviously we can make like a 30 centimeter section that pops into there. Right, so that is that section over there. Now moving along, you can see the harness over there, my finger moving along there, it's going to come around to the front and it's going to break out over here. First thing that breaks out is your oil control valves. Remember, VVT-i system, so you've got your oil control valve to control the VVT-i on the inlet cam only. Next up, we've got our coolant temp harness. Now in this particular case, you'll see we've got a 3-pin plug on here, so you can see nicely there. What you also notice is we've only got a 2-pin plug on there. So what we actually have done is, depending on your vehicle, we've added an extra wire in, so you could run it to a single wire temp sensor for your gauge if you do require that. Now, obviously on the JZX110 and JZS171, they do actually have space for a second temp sensor. It's just blocked off. It's a legacy item from the JZX100 where they actually had a physical temperature sensor that went to the dash, whereas the newer ones obviously changed over to the MPX, and that's how they communicated the coolant temp to the dash. So if you do want to fit a temperature sensor for a dash, again, you can just phone us up and we can make you this, but obviously with not only that plug for your standard sensor, but also the plug for the gauge temp. And even if you wanted to change a standard sensor over to a Bosch sensor, because you can get it more readily available, obviously we can then just unplug that and make you whatever connector you require on there as well. Moving further along there, we break out at the next section down here, and that is going to go to your crank sensor over there. It's going to go to your alternator plug over there. So we do take care of all the signal wires for the alternator. Obviously, you guys are still responsible for connecting the main power of the alternator. And as always, I will advise, as every Toyota does, I usually run these through a big fuse, like 120 amp or 100 amp or whatever you have available, just because it means that this long wire that's going to be running all the way along here to the battery or the fuse box or whatever that you've got inside the engine bay, it just means if anything goes wrong that it will actually blow, and then you haven't got a wire that's capable of catching fire running literally all the way across the block. Okay. Next up, we have our Mac harness or Mac boost valve on there, just a little 2-pin plug over there. Now, obviously, we do put it at the front here because we find most people are wiring the Mac boost valve close to the turbo, so that's why we've done that over there. But because it does unplug, we can make this literally as long as you want. We can actually give you an extension harness as well, so they can just unplug that, plug into there, and then this one can plug into the extension harness on the other side. So you can move that wherever you want. You just need to obviously work with us, let us know how long you want the extension to be, and we can make that up for you guys and get that out to you relatively straightforward and quickly. Right, so that is the entire layout of the harness. Hopefully it's a good explanation on not just what is here now, but obviously what it is capable of doing in the event that you do want to change things. All right, so as I said, what we're going to do now is we're going to move over to the connectors, the actual wires that you're going to connect inside your car, what's in these sort of expansion plugs as well. Okay, so first thing we're going to do, we're going to look at the 2 plugs in the fuse box, and the first one I'm going to start on is the 6-pin plug because it's only got 2 wires in. It's going to be nice and quick to get through. Plus, they're actually only relevant if you have a gearbox harness, as you'll see when I go through them now. So Pin number 1 is a red with a blue tracer. So you can see I've got red with a blue tracer and an orange wire in there. So red with the blue is the reverse light. So in other words, it'll give out 12 volts if a reverse switch is connected. Now, obviously in this case, there is no gearbox harness, so that's not actually going to do anything at all. And same with the second one, which is our orange wire. That is a speed signal. So if you did connect, obviously, a Hall effect speed sensor to this particular sub harness over here, then what you could do is bring that out to there to whatever cluster or speedo that you're going to use and get the signal from there. Just a quick note, the actual speed wire is also connected to the ECU. So if you do put a Hall effect speed sensor in, you're not only going to get the speed through the orange wire, you're also going to be able to pick up speed on the ECU itself. So that might be useful for some people. Okay, so that is the 2-pin plug now, relatively straightforward. Let's move on to our 9-pin plug, which again, if you've watched all our videos, is a pretty standard plug that we do. All right, so first one is red. It is a thick 14 gauge wire. Now, this is what I would normally say is the permanent 12 volt supply. In all honesty, because this is an aftermarket ECU and it doesn't require a permanent supply, you could technically connect this to ignition. But this supplies power to everything. So your fuel pump relay, your starter relay, the whole 9 yards. So I do advise whatever source you are connecting it to, make sure it's got a decent amperage so that obviously you're not going to blow it every single time you turn something on, like the fuel pump or the starter motor, etc. Okay, but you can connect it to permanent 12 volts. It's also not a problem. It's not going to mean that anything is turning on. It just means that obviously you go straight to the battery, you get a nice decent power source directly to the fuse box to be distributed around there. Next up is going to be black with the yellow. So that's this one over here. This is the starter signal. Now, again, with most of our link ECUs that we set up now, the ECU is controlling the starter, not that wire over there. So that wire is just taking a signal to the ECU to tell it to activate the starter relay. So that can be 12 volts or it can be ground. At this moment in time, it is set up to receive a 12 volts. And that's basically because that's the majority of people. That's what you're going to have. You're going to use a key barrel, so you're going to have 12 volts. There's nothing stopping you from providing a ground to that one. You just need to change the settings in the ECU to tell it that the starter signal is going low rather than going high. That's all you need to do. So you can be 12 volts or ground, but we just leave it at 12 volts because majority of people are going to have that when they come to it. Next up is going to be our yellow with the green wire. So that's this one I've got in my finger over there. You can slightly see the green on it there. That is the temp for the gauge. That was what I was speaking about over here. Okay, so that is obviously not connected in this case, but what we'll do when we come to the testing, I am actually going to connect it up so we can see that this device is going to convert the signal so that the temperature shows on the cluster over there. Next up, number 4 is going to be gray. So it's a gray 16 gauge wire. This is for your fuel pump. Now, this is controlled via the fuse box, via the ECU. Right, so you are more than happy to take this directly to a fuel pump. It is 16 gauge. The relay is capable of 20 amps, and you do have a 20 amp fuse in there for the fuel pump. So by all means, if your system drags more than 20 amps, which most systems won't, but if that's the case and you want to use it, you can also use this signal just to control a relay closer to the fuel pump if you require more than 20 amps to run your fuel pumps. Okay, that's obviously when you're looking for more power. Again, you can use that on there as well. Okay, so that is the fuel pump. Next up is going to be yellow with a red. So hopefully you can see it down there. I'm just holding in my finger there. That is check engine light. So in this case, it's connected to our cluster. So it'll show up on our cluster when we turn the ignition on over there. Now, bear in mind, that is giving out a ground. So if you're using your own sort of LED to power it, remember that's ground, other side 12 volts. Most clusters usually rely on the signals coming in as being ground because it's easier to send grounds all over the place than 12 volts and they short out. So usually if you just use a standard cluster, it's going to be absolutely fine. That's the signal that's going to be looking for. Next up is yellow. That's that one over there that I'm holding up there. I don't know if you can see it over there. Okay, that is tacho signal or rev counter signal. So I've connected directly to our cluster over here. So when we come to actually running the car, you're going to see that signal coming through there and you're going to see the tacho working. Now, because it is an aftermarket ECU, you can control the signal that comes out for the tach. So don't stress about that. You can just adapt it to work with whatever cluster, etc., or rev counter that you are working with. Next up is black with a red. Okay, so that is your ignition 12 volts. Now this is what actually turns everything on. Okay, so nice and simple. You're just going to take the ignition source from the key barrel if that's what you're going to use, or if you're going to use like a flick switch, the other side 12 volts and then the other side to that black with a red wire. Now, if you are using a key barrel, just remember that there are 2 types of 12 volt signals. You have accessory and you have ignition. Now, this happens more than you think, but basically when you guys are looking for a 12 volt signal from a key barrel, you get your multimeter out, you turn the ignition on, you look for a 12 volt, you say, ah, there you go, that's perfect. That's not strictly the case. Accessory feeds will be cut when the key moves to the start position. Okay, why is that important? Well, obviously, if you connect that black with a red wire to the accessory feed, as soon as you go to start, it's going to cut the power to the whole system and nothing is going to work. Okay, so if you are looking from a key barrel, find a 12 volts, move the key to the start position, make sure the 12 volts remains. If the 12 volts disappears, then you found the accessory 12 volts, and you can use it to power things like radios or whatever you want to. Okay, right, so that's the ignition one. Moving on, we've got our pink with the blue wire over here. So that's over there. That's obviously connected to our box, which is going to make our alternator light work on the dash when we come to the testing part. But that is also a ground signal coming out. Now, there is one thing I do want to say about the charge lights, and it's something that I've come across before. Again, it happens more than you think. But basically, in all the Lexus systems that they use and Toyota systems they use there, they have some sort of diode system inside the cluster that stops back feeding into the system. Now, remember, with these ones, the later ones, they used MPX to communicate. So that actual alternator wire actually went to the ECU, not to the cluster, right? But in modern cars, you can just connect it straight up because they usually got a diode, or they use LEDs in the dash, which is fantastic. Now, what I have seen is on the older dashes that use just the incandescent bulbs, you can actually get a back feed from the cluster into the system. The problem arises is that the alternator has a couple of connections and they also run to the fuse box as well. So what I've seen in the past once or twice is that actually the alternator light and the 12 volts coming from the cluster can actually back feed into the system and go into the fuse box and keep the system alive. And also, worst case scenario, they tend to backfeed into the alternator and they tend to cause the regulator to wear out and break very, very quickly, like some cases within a month of ownership. So do be careful of that. If you are just fitting a panel, use an LED. That solves the problem immediately because an LED is a diode. If you want to use a dash that is normally using incandescent bulbs, possibly switch out the light bulb in the dash for an LED. Again, that will resolve your issue. If you don't want to do that, last resort is to fit a diode physically in the pink with the blue wire to not allow any back feeding into the system. Okay, right, so that is the pink-blue alternator light. Next up is your yellow with the black light wire, which is this one over here, so yellow with the black tracer. Again, that's communicating to there because that is oil pressure switch. So that's going to make our dash work in a minute when we turn the ignition on to do those sort of testings. Right, so important, that also does give off a ground, okay? But in this case, there's no issue with any type of sort of feedback, so you don't have to stress too much about it. But also bearing in mind that because you can change the setup, in this case, we're using the oil pressure switch, but let's say you wanted to just use an oil pressure sensor and you scrap this off altogether, then obviously that yellow with the black wire is not going to work because that's going to be connected to only a switch. Now, as I said, you are capable of having the switch as well as a pressure sensor, even a pressure and a temp sensor if you wanted to. You can get readily available T pieces that would give you a 1/8 NPT on the one side, on the middle, and then on the other end you get a female fitting so you can put the standard oil pressure switch back in again. So you can run both. That's really not a problem at all. Sometimes it can be useful because obviously if the sensor fails, you still have the oil lights, which is quite important, and obviously you can use that as well. Right, so that's the 9-pin plug and that's the 6-pin plug sorted out. So let's move over to these auxiliary plugs over here. Now, the pedal one is relatively straightforward. You've basically got the signal, one signal for a main, one signal for a secondary from an accelerator position sensor, and the other one is 5 volts and the other one is ground. And obviously we've got that down here. So 1 is primary signal, 2 is secondary signal, 3 is 5 volts, and 4 is sensor ground. So relatively straightforward. Moving on to the auxiliary plug, so the 6-pin DTM. Now that has got digital input 1, 2, 5, 6, 7. It's also got auxiliary 6, which is an output as well. Okay, so to give you an example, you've got the fuel wire that we give you the fuse box, but let's say you started to then start pushing some big power and you wanted to fit 2 fuel pumps. You could then use auxiliary 6 to turn on the secondary pump. So again, you have strategies where you'll run one pump for sort of, low load, low RPM, etc. And then what you could do is fit a fuel pressure sensor onto the system, and you could tell the ECU that when the fuel pressure dropped below a certain value, it would then activate a second fuel pump to bring the pressure back up again. So there's loads of things you can do with that, but it just allows you to have that. You could also control cooling fans with it if you wanted to. You could do whatever you want with it, basically. The digital inputs is obviously more for things like switches. So if you wanted like an anti-lag switch or like a launch control switch or something like that, they can all be then connected into this one over here. Okay. Then, as I said, you've got your CAN plugs over there. So you've got the one coming from the ECU, and that is going to be having CAN. 1 is CAN high, 2 is CAN low. Then the other one that comes out of the harness here, that's your power supply. And obviously pin 1 is CAN 12 volts and pin 2 is CAN ground or earth. Now what we have done, as you can see, is this one is a female, or this one is a female and this one is a male, so you cannot plug it into the wrong one. So we did actually swap those plugs around, so it makes it much easier and you guys can't feed 12 volts down the CAN lines directly into the ECU. Okay, right, so those are all the plugs attached to it. That's the complete layout. I hope that's been mega helpful, and not only to show you how to put it on, Chris, but obviously to show you what upgradability you do have with your particular setup over there. One little quirk about the Altezza plugin that I do want to go through with you guys is obviously the Altezza only had one knock sensor. Now this would normally be a problem for a JZ because you've got 2 knock sensors, but luckily with the new G4X they do knock windowing. So what we've actually done in this particular case is both of these knock sensors are connected together, but it'll pick up a noise level. Obviously with the ECU knowing exactly which cylinder should be firing, that is no problem. We've effectively joined the 2 microphones together into one input. But obviously, as I said, because the ECU knows exactly when each cylinder is firing, it knows which cylinder is knocking without obviously having to worry about the fact that you've got 2 microphones connected into one. So little quirk with the Altezza plugin, obviously easily rectified by the software. So again, no major issues over there. So what we're going to do now is we're going to move into the testing. So let me get everything ready and then we'll come back and we'll be ready to test. So bear with me a second, I'll be back. Hello guys, so now we're going to move into the testing part, and as I said, there's going to be 2 sections to this. One is going to be just with the ignition on, and the other one is going to be actually with the engine running. Now with the ignition on the testing, you'll see I've not got an inlet manifold or anything on here. That's because we're going to be testing the coils and injectors, and obviously you want to make sure that they are working in the exact setup the customer's going to use. So what I'm going to do first of all is I'm going to go through exactly what we're going to test, and then obviously we'll jump in and start testing. So with the ignition on, what we're going to be looking for, the first one is the check engine light. So on the fuse box here, you'll see we have a little LED down over there. That is a check engine light. So even if you don't connect it to a dash, you can see that the ECU and everything is turning on as you would expect it to. Obviously, we're also going to look for the check engine light on the dash because we do have that yellow with the red wire wired up to the cluster over there. Next up, we're going to look for the charge light. So it's going to pop up there on the actual cluster itself. What I'll then do is I'll unplug the alternator so you can see the light goes off, and then I'll plug it back in again so you can see that it goes on. And then next up is the oil pressure, pardon, and we'll do exactly the same thing. So I'm going to show you that it appears on the dash. I'll go unplug the oil, it'll go off, plug it back in again, it goes back on again. Right, then we're going to test the fuel pump relay. So I'm just going to pop over to the software for the Link ECU. I'm going to activate the output and you're going to hear the relay click. Obviously I don't have a fuel pump hooked up now, so we're just looking for that relay to click over. And then we're going to test the injectors and the coils, okay? So what I'm going to do is, with the Link software, you can test all your outputs. I do have videos. At the end of this, there'll be a link to our Link ECU playlist. It'll show you exactly how you test all of the outputs. At this moment, I'm just testing the injectors and the coils just to give you guys a flavor of what you can test. Obviously, you can test a whole bunch of other stuff. But because I've already made those videos, I'm just going to leave those at the end for you guys to have a look through there. Okay. That's then going to cover this just with the ignition on, and then we're going to stop, set everything up, and then we're actually going to move to starting the engine up. And then we're just going to be testing the starter circuit because all of our ECUs are controlling the starter as per the wiring that I went through earlier. And then we're going to test the tacho to make sure the tacho signal is coming through on the cluster. We'll check that the coolant temp is working, so making sure that the dash is showing a coolant temperature, and then we'll test the drive-by-wire, actually rev the engine and make sure that's working exactly as expected to. Okay, so jumping into the first part, which just with the ignition on, obviously requires me to put the ignition on. So let me pop around here and I'm going to do that. So as per the wiring of the plugs, I'm just going to take my black with the red wire over there. I'm going to give it 12 volts. And as soon as I do, you'll see straight away that you heard a bunch of clicks of the relay. I've got the check engine light on the dash. I've got the check engine light on the cluster. I also have the battery light over there, and I have the oil pressure light over there. Okay, so those are all working. Now I want to make sure that obviously they are working correctly and wired up to the correct thing. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to pull out the 3-pin alternator plug. As soon as I do, you'll see the battery light has now gone off. I'm going to plug it back in again. And you'll see the battery light has come back on again. So that's nice and straightforward. So let's move over to the oil pressure. So I'm just going to pop that up there. You can see the oil pressure switch light has gone off. And as I plug it back in again, There you can see the oil light has come back on again. So I'm happy with that. So they're both working and they're both hooked up to the correct items. Right, so moving on to the rest of it, we said we're going to do the oil pressure. Right, so now we're going to do the fuel pump. Now, if you listen closely, you'll actually see the fuel pump did prime. So you heard the relay click on, and then a few seconds later you heard the relay click off. But nice and simple, we're just going to go over to our auxiliary outputs in this particular case. We're going to go over to fuel pump control. So hopefully you can see that over there. It's going to pop up over here, so you can see we've got fuel pump control over there. It tells us that it's a standard system. Ignition 7 is the fuel pump relay output. And in this case, we can test the output. So I'm just going to hit that. And as I hit it on, you're going to hear the relay click. There you go. Turn it off. Fantastic. Okay, so I've tested the fuel pump relay, so I know that that works, and the ECU is controlling it exactly as I expect it to. So next up, we're just going to go through the injectors and the coils. So briefly, all I'm going to do is I'm going to activate the output, then I'm going to come along and I'm going to disconnect it. So all of the injectors and all of the coils are connected. So when I pull the injector plug off, you're going to hear the ticking is going to stop. That tells me that that is wired to the correct one. Okay, so what we're going to do is move over to our fuel. So hopefully you can see that in the corner there. You can go to fuel setup and you go to injector test. Then over here, you can choose which injector you want to test. So that'll say injector 1 over there. So I'm just going to click on that. You can hear it clicking away like mad. Just going to unplug it. Completely stops. Plug it back in again. So that is wired correctly and going to the correct injector. We're going to go over to injector 2. Pop over here. There you go. So we know that one's wired correctly. So let's pop over to injector 3. Pop over to injector 3, and that's perfect. Right, then let's go over to injector 4. You can hear the note slightly change as the different injectors start clicking away, but that's that one. We're going to pop over to injector 5, if I don't miss it. Injector 5. Pop that one off, it stops clicking, so I know that's correct. And lastly, let's pop over to injector 6. And again, same story. Unplug that, stops clicking. Plug it in, carries on clicking. All right, then obviously I want to turn that off. So nice and quiet. Right, moving over to the ignition now. Again, we go to our ignition tab over there, and you can see we've got ignition test over there. All I'm going to do is I'm going to select ignition 1. You can probably hear it clicking away. I'm just going to lift up the coil slightly. And that's going to become very loud. Right, so that's ignition 1. So we're super happy with that. Let's go over to ignition 2. Those valves are closed. There you go, you can hear that nice and loud there. Let's go to ignition 3. And again, I'm going to lift up number 3 slightly. You can hear that nice and loud, and the valves are obviously closed because you can't hear it on the outside. Ignition 4. Alright, you can hear that nice and loud as well. Let's go to ignition 5. And again, there you go, you can hear that nice and loudly. And then last up is ignition 6. And again, same story. I'm just gonna, you can hear that nice and loud in there as well. Alright, so let's go ahead and let's turn that to off. Okay, so as I said in the beginning, there's a playlist at the end of the video after the pictures of obviously the complete harness that's going to take you through all the processes on Link that we've done so far. Right, that's everything from setting base timing, setting up your inputs and your outputs, and so on and so forth. Now obviously the customers that buy the harnesses from us, as they go through the whole testing procedure, by the time they get the ECU, everything is set up according to what they've opted for. So like in this case, obviously we haven't done fuel pressure or temp or oil pressure or temp or anything like that, because it's not on the harness and will only cause errors to appear on the ECU. But obviously that video will show you later on down the line, if you do want to add in those particular features, exactly how you set them up, and more importantly, how you test them as well. Okay, so I'm not going to go through all of that. Loads of videos there. If there's anything in those videos that you guys haven't seen that you would like to see, please let me know, either in the comments down below or message us on the Facebook page. We get Link ECUs and Haltech and it all through the time. So basically, as soon as you guys bring up a topic you want to know about, let me know. We'll do a video explaining it in detail so you guys are aware of exactly how everything works. Right, so that is just with the ignition part on now. So what I have to do is obviously connect fuel up. We're going to put the throttle and intake manifold and everything on so we can actually get this thing running. So bear with me a second and I'll do that. See you now. Bye. Right, so now we've got it ready for the testing with the engine actually running. So we've added the fuel in. We swapped out a couple of the harnesses because obviously we can't run the Audi coils with the standard throttle on there. So you'll see we're running the dumb coils on there, and we've created our own little sub harness so we can use the igniter and everything as well. So just to recap what we're going to test now with the engine actually running, it's quite a short one. We've gone a lot of the stuff through on just the ignition test, and obviously at the end we'll have all the videos as per usual for the whole link playlist that we've done with all the bits and bobs that we go through there. So first thing we're going to test is the starter circuit. So as we said, literally this is a one-touch start. So in other words, you're just going to touch the starter wire with 12 volts and the ECU will take over and then it'll start the engine up. Then we'll go over and we'll look at the cluster for the tacho signal to make sure that that's coming through correctly. We'll also do the coolant temp. So that's another harness that we've just swapped out, because in this case we need to have both the temp sensors connected that I've put into the block over there. Okay. And then obviously we're going to test the drive-by-wire to make sure that that does actually work. All right, so just a little tip while I'm here actually, because we did struggle with this throttle for quite some time actually, with the inability to calibrate the TPS. We kept getting the error 16 H-bridge reverse polarity, and little tip, just turned out the throttle was dirty and so the return spring wasn't working correctly. So if you guys are struggling with throttles, specifically these ETCSI ones that come on this one and the JZX100 or JZX110, JZS171, give them a good clean before you start to do all the calibration and everything for them, just to make sure that everything is working exactly as it should. Because again, I struggled with it for ages and then just gave it a nice clean and boom, she calibrated immediately. So nice little tip for you guys there as well. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is we're just going to pop over. I'm going to get my ear defenders on and then we're going to fire her up and then we're going to check all the items as I listed over there. So let me do that. Right, so ignition's obviously still on. Going to touch that over, and as soon as I touch it, you're going to see the engine's going to start. So I'm just going to touch. Right, so there you go. Right, so what we want to test is the starter circuit, which we know works exactly as we expect it to. Then we're going to pop over to the tacho signal, and you can see we're getting a tacho signal through this, and that is perfect. Also the coolant temp, so you can see the coolant temp is working there. That's being communicated via our little box to the dash over there, so we know our yellow and our green wire is working correctly. And then lastly, we're just going to rev it up so we can make sure that the actual drive-by-wire motor is working correctly. Rightio. So that's pretty much it. So I'm just going to disconnect the fuel pump for now, so that we can run her out of fuel. You can see that little valve is going to go down now. Goes. Okay, so when you guys are working with these types of engines, especially the 2JZ GE VVT-i, obviously it's a deadhead system, there's no return built into it. You'll often see these little fuel pulsation dampers. They're not regulators, they're just there to remove the pulsations in the fuel pressure to help with the flow across the injectors. So you'll notice that there's a little screw in the top here. Don't ever screw that in. That is literally just a means of telling that you've got pressure. So you saw when I first panned the camera over, the screw was all the way up. And at the base of the screw where there's almost like a washer, but it's part of the screw, that was kind of sitting level with the top there. That tells you you've got fuel pressure. It's not really relevant in the case of like a 1JZ GT VVT-i or a 2JZ GT VVT-i because they have a return system, so it's completely separate. But just a nice little tip for you guys when you do come across these things on a Toyota. Not a regulator, fuel pulsation damper. Two completely different things, okay, and do serve two completely different functions. And don't ever screw it because you're only just going to damage it basically and break it. Right, okay, so that's pretty much the engine. We've heard it nicely. She starts up, she runs. We don't get any errors or anything like that. Lambda's reading correctly as it should. Obviously, I've tested that prior, and I've done the video on how to set up the CAN Lambda on the Link ECU, so you guys can obviously go ahead and watch that. Okay, right, but that's it. So let's get this off to the customer, Chris, and let him get it in his car and get it running. So we'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.